They arrived in silence. That would be the first detail humanity remembered later, long after everything else had been catalogued, analyzed, and argued over in exhausted briefing rooms. Not their size, not their numbers, not even the impossible geometry of their vessels as they slipped out of fold space at the outer edge of the heliopause like thoughts becoming real. It was the silence. No warning burst across comm channels. No demand for surrender. No broadcasted doctrine of superiority. No ceremonial announcement of conquest. Nothing that could be answered, intercepted, or even misunderstood. Just absence where communication should have been. And then, presence. Thousands of warships unfolding into normal space with deliberate precision, each one taking its place in formations so exact they felt pre-calculated rather than commanded. Entire fleets arranging themselves in orbital lattice patterns around the system, like a net that had already decided what it would catch. There was no rush, no chaos, no hesitation, only inevitability. To every sensor array watching from the inner planets, it looked less like an invasion and more like a conclusion finally arriving on schedule. As if the system had always been waiting for this moment, and only now had something come to collect it. Admiral Yara Vasquez was drinking cold coffee at Lunar Defense Command when the proximity alarm turned every screen in the building the color of blood. She put the mug down slowly. That detail would end up in history books. The slow, deliberate placement of a ceramic mug on a composite desk, while the largest hostile fleet ever recorded, assembled itself at the outer edge of the solar system. People would debate what it meant. Composure, denial, the simple muscle memory of a soldier who had trained for this moment so many times that the real thing felt for exactly 3 seconds like another drill. Then she saw the count. 47,212 vessels. She picked the mug back up and finished the coffee. The Keth'ari were not unknown to humanity. They had been a ghost story for 11 years, whispered about in the diplomatic channels of the Interstellar Compact, referenced in redacted threat assessments described by the 3 species who had survived contact with them as patient, methodical, and utterly without mercy. They did not conquer for resources. They did not enslave for labor. The Valhari had tried to explain it once in broken Mandarin, transmitted through 3 relay stations. The closest translation anyone had managed was, "They collect the silence where civilizations used to be. They erase completely surgically, and then they move on, leaving behind star systems scrubbed clean of every frequency a living thing might produce." 11 years of preparation. 11 years of the United Earth Defense Compact. Building, fortifying, recruiting, and most importantly, planning. Because humanity had one advantage the Keth'ari had never encountered before. Every species the Keth'ari had destroyed had waited to be attacked, had positioned their fleets at their homeworld, had tried to meet force with force at the center, at the thing they loved most, with everything they had. Humanity had studied those battles, every one of them, in excruciating detail, and humanity had decided to do something different. Vasquez opened a channel to the 16 fleet commanders positioned throughout the system. Her voice was flat, professional, and carried the particular quality of a human being who is not afraid, because they already made their peace with the worst outcome months ago, and have since moved on to pure, focused intention. She said 4 words. Execute Labyrinth all stations on the outer planets. Things began to move. The Keth'ari Grand Admiral, a being called Serathon, whose species communicated in layered chemical pulses, but had learned to process electromagnetic language, watched the human response on its tactical display, and felt something it had not felt in 114 campaigns. Uncertainty. The humans were not retreating to Earth. They were not massing at Mars. They were not doing any of the 17 predicted formation responses that the Keth'ari strategic models had calculated and already prepared counters for. Instead, the human ships, and there were fewer of them, so many fewer, barely 900 vessels in total, were spreading out, dispersing across the entire system in patterns that looked to Serathon's analytical mind less like a defensive formation and more like something being drawn. It was watching a trap being set. The uncertainty was brief. Serathon had not led 114 campaigns by being uncertain for long. The humans had fewer ships, a smaller star system, no allies within response range, and a homeworld that sat at the gravitational center of everything they were trying to protect. The mathematics were absolute. 47,000 ships against 900 was not a battle. It was a conclusion. Sarathon ordered the advance. The noose began to tighten, and deep inside the asteroid belt in a constellation that appeared on no Keth'ari scan, because it had been built over 6 years, using materials with a specific electromagnetic absorption profile that humanity's engineers had designed specifically to defeat Keth'ari sensor technology. Admiral Cheney looked at the same tactical display as Sarath and allowed himself a single quiet smile. They were inside the grid, all 47,000 of them. The Keth'ari advance moved in the formation they had used for a century, the consuming crescent, a vast curving line of warships that swept inward from all vectors simultaneously, designed to compress a defending fleet into an ever-shrinking sphere until the defenders were packed so tightly that their own weapons became liabilities. It was elegant. It had worked on 14 civilizations. It was by any objective measure one of the most refined instruments of total annihilation ever developed by an intelligent species. It worked because it assumed the defending fleet would cluster together. Humanity's 900 ships did not cluster. They held their dispersed positions across the system, 3 ships here, 7 there, a lone destroyer sitting in the shadow of Titan, a pair of frigates running dark behind the iron mass of Sirisur. From above, the pattern they formed would have looked meaningless, scattered, panicked even. But the Keth'ari advance was not looking at the human ships. It was looking at Earth, a pale blue point of light at the center of everything, growing slowly closer as 47,000 warships pressed inward. Admiral Vasquez watched the crescent advance past the outer marker buoys. Each one disguised as debris, each one broadcasting a tight beam signal to exactly one receiver. She waited. The Keth'ari fleet crossed the orbit of Uranus. Still, the humans didn't mass. Still, they didn't respond in any of the 17 predicted ways. Sarah Ann noted this in the campaign record with the Keth'ari equivalent of a footnote. Humans display non-standard dispersal behavior, origin unclear, tactical significance negligible, and continued the advance. They crossed the orbit of Saturn. Vasquez opened her channel again. Stations 1 through 40. Hot start 30 seconds. Beneath the orbital plane of the solar system, beneath the ecliptic, in positions so far below and above the plane of the planets that no enemy fleet advancing from the helipause would ever think to watch them. 40 relay platforms came online simultaneously. Each one was not a weapon. Each one was something far more dangerous in this specific context. A gravity lens array, a piece of technology humanity had spent 8 years, and the industrial output of 4 planets developing, based on theoretical work that had originally been dismissed as science fiction by 3 separate review committees. What a gravity lens array did at its core was simple. It bent space, not dramatically, not enough to create a fold point or a wormhole, just enough, a nudge, a lean, a subtle warping of local space-time that introduced a drift into the trajectory of any object in its influence radius. Any object, including warships, the drift was small. That was the beauty of it. At the scale of a single ship, the deviation introduced by any one gravity lens array was less than a meter per second in velocity change. Nothing imperceptible, not even a rounding error on a Keth'ari navigation plot. But humanity had 40 arrays precisely positioned, and there were 47,000 ships in the Keth'ari fleet, all of them now deep inside a solar system that was very quietly beginning to redirect them. The consuming crescent was designed to compress inward and crush everything at the center. That required every element of the crescent to maintain its relative position. The geometry of the formation depended on all 47,000 ships arriving at the inner sphere at the same time from all vectors simultaneously. If any element arrived early, it exposed a flank. If any element arrived late, it created a gap. The crescent's lethality was its precision. The gravity lens arrays didn't stop the ships. They didn't slow them down. They simply introduced 40 separate, tiny, almost completely undetectable variations in trajectory. Some elements of the crescent were going to arrive a few minutes early. Some were going to arrive a few minutes late. And some the ones whose drift vectors had been calculated by an AI running on 17 linked quantum processors over the course of 3 years. An AI that had done nothing else for 3 years except model Keth'ari fleet behavior and compute the exact optimal drift angle for maximum formation disruption. We're going to arrive slightly out of plane. Not much. 2 degrees, 3 degrees enough. In the inner system, Earth's population of 11 billion people was not watching entertainment feeds or going about their days in blissful ignorance. That was the other thing the Keth'ari models had not predicted, because they had never encountered it before. A species that when the end of everything arrived, chose to watch it happen and refused to look away. Every screen on Earth was showing the tactical feed. 11 billion people sitting in their homes, their schools, their offices, watching a display of colored icons advance toward a small blue dot, watching 900 icons hold their ground, watching a plan they'd been told about but hadn't dared believe in begin to unfold. In the asteroid belt installation, Admiral Chen Wei was doing math he'd already done 10,000 times. The math kept coming out the same. He keyed his calm. Vasquez drift is taking hold. Outer arc of the crescent is already 2.3 minutes ahead of schedule. I see it. Vasquez said she was looking at the same display from Lunar Command, watching the perfect geometric crescent of Keth'ari ships develop the first hairline fractures of deviation, not visible yet at normal scale. She had the display zoomed to a factor that made individual ships the size of pinheads and made the formation's imperfections visible. How long until Serathon notices their navigation systems are good, but they're looking at Earth, not at each other? I'd say a pause. We have maybe 12 minutes before someone on their end starts running cross-checks. 12 minutes is plenty, Vasquez said. She opened the channel to all 900 human ships simultaneously. This is Vasquez. Formation drift is confirmed on all 40 arcs. Begin Phase 2. All ships move to intercept corridors. Target assignments are in your queue. You trained for this. You know what to do. 900 ships began to move. Not toward Earth, not toward the center, toward the gaps. The tiny, precise, mathematically inevitable gaps that were opening in the consuming crescent, like fault lines in a glacier, invisible from inside the formation, invisible to any sensor looking outward toward the enemy, visible only to someone who had spent 3 years teaching an AI to predict exactly where they would appear. The Keth'ari fleet was the most powerful assembled armada in the history of the local arm. It had come to Sol system to deliver silence. It had no idea. It had just sailed into the most elaborate ambush in the history of human warfare. The first Keth'ari ships to die never saw what killed them. That was by design. The 900 human vessels had been armed, refitted, and in several cases, entirely redesigned over the past 4 years, with one tactical doctrine in mind: kill in the gaps, kill fast, and never be where the enemy looks. Every human ship in the fleet carried a loadout that leaned almost entirely on railgun kinetics and drone swarms rather than energy weapons, because energy weapons left signatures, and signatures told you where to look. Kinetics, especially the narrow-profile tungsten rods humanity had been manufacturing by the billion since the Keth'ari threat became real, were nearly invisible until they arrived. When they arrived at 75% of the speed of light. The Keth'ari destroyers on the leading edge of the disrupted outer arc were the first to go. Not in explosions. At those velocities, the kinetics punched through the ships like needles through paper, and the structural failure happened a full 3 seconds later, after the rod had already continued another 2,000 kilometers downrange and found a second target. 14 ships in the outer arc went dark before the Keth'ari tactical net flagged the anomalies. 14 ships in a fleet of 47,000. A rounding error. But the anomalies were real, and Serathon's flagship computational array identified them with the speed of a predator that had survived 100 campaigns by never ignoring small things. The Grand Admiral did not panic. It redirected sensor arrays, ran identification protocols on the trajectory signatures of the kinetic impacts, and began calculating the probable position of the human ships responsible. This took 48 seconds. In 48 seconds, the human fleet had moved. This was the other thing the Keth'ari had not modeled. Human ships, specifically human ships designed for this engagement, were fast. Not in terms of top speed, the Keth'ari fleet outpaced them significantly in open space. But in terms of acceleration curve, in terms of the 0 to maximum velocity window, humanity had spent a decade engineering drives that could go from cold stop to full combat speed in 11 seconds flat. The engineering principle was simple and brutal. You cannot use conventional momentum models to intercept a ship that can change its acceleration profile faster than your targeting solution can update. Every human ship in the fleet could in 11 seconds be somewhere other than where it had just been. This made them extraordinarily difficult to shoot. It also made them extraordinarily difficult to trap. In the gaps of the disrupted crescent, the 900 human ships were operating not as a conventional fleet, but as a distributed swarm. Each vessel assigned a specific kill corridor. Each vessel working in pairs, one ship firing while the other moved, the firing ship then moving while the partner fired. A leapfrog rhythm that meant there was never a moment when both ships in a pair were stationary long enough to be successfully targeted. The drone swarms preceded them not as weapons but as sensor nets reading the local space, feeding data back in tight beam bursts, painting the battlefield in a resolution that human commanders used to identify the next gap, the next corridor, the next angle of approach. Sarathon understood what was happening approximately 4 minutes after it started. The human fleet had not dispersed in panic. It had dispersed into a pre-arranged kill network that was now operating from inside the formation itself. The crescent, the masterwork of Keth'ari strategic doctrine, had been converted by the humans' own positioning into a cage. Every element of the crescent that turned to engage the human ships had to turn away from the rest of the formation, creating new gaps. Every ship that fired into the interior of the formation risked hitting its own fleetmates. The geometry that made the consuming crescent lethal had been inverted, turned inside out. Sarathon issued the order to collapse the formation, pull every ship inward, compress, present a solid mass rather than a spread formation. The gravity lens arrays anticipated this. They had been programmed to anticipate this because the Keth'ari response to formation disruption was as consistent across their campaigns as the crescent itself. When the collapse order went out, the arrays adjusted their drift angles very slightly in precisely the ways Chenwei's AI had modeled 3 years ago. The collapse produced new problems. Compressed ships moving inward in a suddenly uncoordinated flow with slightly misaligned trajectories began to occupy the same space in ways that the Keth'ari traffic management systems hadn't been designed for, because no one had ever designed a trap that used the victim's own fleet against them as an obstacle field. There were collisions, not many, 112 in the first 8 minutes of the collapse order. But a collision between 2 Keth'ari capital ships produced debris fields of a scale that human commanders had also modeled. The debris fields were moving. They were moving at the velocities the ships had been moving at when they struck each other. In a compressed formation, those debris fields propagated. On Earth, 11 billion people watched the tactical display update in real time. Watched the Keth'ari fleet icons, each one representing a ship that could glass a continent, begin to wink out. Not quickly, not in the dramatic, decisive cascade of a battle won in minutes. Slowly, steadily, the way a great thing bleeds out when it has been cut in the right place at the right time by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had been patient enough to wait for the moment. Somewhere in the 3rd hour of the battle, a child watching from an apartment in Nairobi asked her father what was happening, and he told her, his voice rough with something that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, that humanity was winning. She asked how. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, because we planned in the inner system, in the clean coordinated chaos of the kill corridors, human ship crews were doing what human ship crews did under extreme sustained stress, which was talk to each other in the specific way that humans under extreme stress have always talked. Dark, precise, occasionally profane, occasionally tender, always moving. The captain of the frigo Unbroken, a woman named Siosai Ta, who had been born in Tonga and grown up in the outer belt mining stations, coordinated her kill runs with the calm of someone hanging laundry while simultaneously narrating targeting data to her weapons officer in a tone of voice that the weapons officer would later describe as the most terrifying and reassuring sound he had ever heard. The captain of the destroyer Meridian, a man who had once been a philosophy professor before the compact recruiter found him, fought his engagement with a running internal commentary he would never share with anyone. A series of observations about the nature of violence and necessity that were extraordinarily precise and entirely useless, but that he continued generating because his mind needed something to do while his hands did the work. His mind found ugly. The crew of the carrier Carthage lost 3 of their drone launch teams to a Keth'ari energy strike that punched through their forward section in the 6th hour of the battle, and the remaining crew sealed the breaches and kept launching, kept feeding the kill network data, kept doing the thing they had trained to do. Their ship's log, recovered later, showed a gap of 11 minutes during which no entries were recorded. Then the entries resumed mid-sentence, as if the crew had decided that what happened in those 11 minutes was not something the log needed to know about. The post-battle interviews would fill in those minutes. The official record would contain them. The crew of the Carthage would receive commendations. 3 of them would not be present for the ceremony. By hour 8, the Keth'ari fleet had lost 6,000 ships. 6,000 from 47,000. It was not yet a victory, but it was something that had never existed before in any record of any species encounter with the Keth'ari Armada. It was a battle that was still going. Sarathon made the decision in the 14th hour. It had run the models. It had run them again. It had run them a third time with different parameters, adjusting for variables the initial campaign planning had failed to account for. The gravity lens drift, the human kinetic doctrine, the specific acceleration profiles of their ships, the topology of the kill corridors, the rate of attrition, the projected timeline to critical mass loss. Every run produced the same output. The campaign was lost, not in the sense that the remaining ships couldn't break through to Earth. They could still do math. The mathematics supported it barely at enormous cost, but lost in the truer sense that the Keth'ari understood instinctively, after a century of conquest, which was that the killing here would never end. Ever other species had broken when their fleets bled. They had sued for peace or scattered, or simply stopped fighting because the will had gone out of them. Sarathon had seen it 114 times. The moment when a defending species understood it was going to lose everything, and the fight stopped. The Keth'ari tactical model of humanity had predicted this moment at approximately 30% fleet losses. Humanity's 900 ships were still fighting, still moving, still coordinating with a precision that had not degraded in 14 hours of continuous engagement, still feeding the kill corridors, still running the leapfrog pairs, still operating the drone nets, still launching kinetics into the churning mass of the Keth'ari formation from angles that Sarathon's targeting systems could not reliably predict because the human ships were using the bodies of destroyed Keth'ari vessels as cover, firing from inside debris fields, firing from the shadow of moons, firing from positions that no sane tactical doctrine recommended, because no sane tactical doctrine had accounted for a species that seemed to view the phrase, "this is impossible," as a suggested starting point for problem-solving. Sarathon thought of the Velhari, of the Chorus of Rings, of the Macarii Dominion, of 14 civilizations that had stood against the Armada and been reduced to silence. It thought of what those species had done at the end, which was fight with desperation, with fear, with the frantic energy of beings who understood they were dying. Human ships fought with something else, something Sarathon's chemical language did not have a direct equivalent for. It had encountered traces of it in the electromagnetic intercepts it had processed from the human communication network over the past 14 hours. That dark, precise, occasionally profane, occasionally tender frequency that humans broadcast to each other constantly, even in the middle of annihilation, as if the act of speaking to one another was itself a weapon. It had taken Sarathon 6 hours of processing to understand what it was. It was enjoyment, not of the killing, but of the doing, of the problem, of the elaborate, brutal, beautiful thing they had built, and were now operating against the greatest military force in the local arm. Not because they thought they would win in the first hour, but because they had decided a decade ago, with cold and systematic fury, to build a plan that gave them a chance. And then they had executed that plan, with everything they had, and they were winning. And somewhere in the human fleet, in every ship, in every corridor, something that Sarathon had never encountered in 114 campaigns was running at full intensity. Pride, not arrogance. Not the pride of beings who thought themselves invincible. The pride of beings who had looked at the worst possible thing in the universe, studied it, planned against it, built the tools to fight it, trained their people to use those tools, and then watched the plan work. Sarah issued the withdrawal order. The Keth'ari fleet had never in its recorded history withdrawn from an engagement. The order was followed, the formation, what remained of it, the 38,000 ships that were still functional, pulling back from the kill corridors in the ragged, uneven way of a fleet that had sustained losses it hadn't been designed to absorb, began the long transit back toward the helipause. On Earth, 11 billion people watched it happen in silence. Then the silence ended. Vasquez at Lunar Command heard it through the building's walls. That sound, that specific, impossible sound, the sound of something that starts in one throat and spreads through every throat within earshot, and then beyond earshot. That sound that a species makes when it has been standing at the edge of its own extinction for 14 hours, and has stepped back from it. She heard that sound, and she sat down, which was the first time she had sat down in 14 hours, and she put her face in her hands. Not in grief, not in relief exactly, in something she didn't have a name for, something that existed in the specific frequency of the thing Serathon had been trying to catalog from a distance, something that couldn't be translated into Keth'ari chemical pulses, because the Keth'ari did not have it, had never needed it, because the Keth'ari had never had to fight this hard for anything, and therefore had never discovered what was on the other side of fighting that hard. And still being alive. Cheney, in the Asteroid Belt installation, compiled the final numbers. 8,944 Keth'ari ships destroyed or disabled. 38,000 in retreat. Human fleet losses, 109 ships. 2,417 crew killed in action. Numbers that would be read aloud at a ceremony 6 months later. Slowly, one name at a time, in a silence so complete it could be heard from orbit. The Keth'ari would not return to Sol system. That much was certain to every analyst who modeled their behavior over the following months, not because they were incapable of returning with a larger force, but because the Keth'ari doctrine of total erasure depended on something it had taken humanity xenopsychologists 8 years to identify: the certainty of silence. The Keth'ari needed to know that when they arrived, the thing they fought would eventually stop, would exhaust itself, would break. They needed the silence to be inevitable. Sol system had broken that certainty definitively. In 14 hours and 6,000 ships and 900 vessels in the cold, patient fury of a species that had decided, 10 years before the Armada arrived, that silence was not acceptable, and that whatever it cost to make that true, they would pay it. The Keth'ari withdrew. They moved on. They found other stars, other systems, other civilizations to approach with their consuming crescent and their ancient perfect doctrine. But word travels even in the silence between stars. Information propagates. Patterns get noticed. And the pattern that began to spread through the diplomatic channels of the Interstellar Compact, through the Velhari relay stations, through the Makari remnant networks, through every species that had survived contact with the Keth'ari by running and hiding and hoping to be forgotten, was simple and unprecedented, and changed the politics of the local arm in ways that are still unfolding. The pattern was this: there is a species. They are small. They have 1 star. They have 9 planets and 1 moon that their children grew up looking at. And when something came to take that moon and those planets and that star away from them, they looked at what was coming, and they made a plan. And the plan worked. Not because humans were the strongest, not because they were the fastest or the most technologically advanced or the most ancient or the most ruthless, but because they were the species that, when given a decade to prepare for their own extinction, had spent that decade not in fear, not in denial, not in the diplomatic scramble for allies who might or might not arrive in time, but in the specific, stubborn, brilliant, unglamorous work of understanding the problem and building the solution, and then trusting the solution when the moment came. Sarah filed its campaign record, the Keth'ari equivalent of a Stauchi after-action report, a chemical document encoding the data of the engagement for future strategic use. It was the first campaign record in Keth'ari history to include a new category, a flag that had never appeared before in 114 campaigns. The flag was a designation for an enemy type. The Keth'ari had categories for fierce enemies, for clever enemies, for enemies who fought with unusual weapons or unusual tactics, for enemies who surprised them once. The new flag was for something different, something that required a new category because no existing category covered it. The chemical translation processed through the Compact's xenolinguistics database rendered it in English as follows: enemy does not accept outcome as fixed. 11 billion people were still celebrating on Earth when the translation came through. A linguist in Geneva read it again, and sent it to a colleague in Lagos with 2 words of her own appended. The colleague read it. She sat back. She looked out her window at a sky that was lit up, still lit up, with the trails of fireworks that had been going since hour 14 when the Keth'ari fleet broke and started running. She read the Keth'ari designation one more time. Enemy does not accept outcome as fixed. She sent the linguist back 1 word.